Thank you. Thank you for that gracious willingness to invite conversation and to continue the conversation and support for all of you. So reach out. If you have questions from our first session, and Dr. Gersovich, please remember to kind of store those away or go on the app and submit them. He'll be able to take those questions in the breakout or in the panel discussion later today. We'd like to introduce our second speaker as Jason gets her up and running. But let me take a moment to tell you a bit about her. Dr. Julia Sadusky is an author, speaker, and licensed psychologist. She owns Lux Counseling and Consulting in Littleton, Colorado, where she offers individual, family, and couples therapy, in addition to consultation for individuals and families around sexuality and gender. She also serves as a youth and ministry educator, offering trainings and consultations to counseling centers and faith-based institutions on sexuality, gender identity, mental health, trauma-informed care, and the intersection of sexuality, gender, and theology. Other areas of focus include work with those experiencing complex trauma and eating disorders. Dr. Sadusky obtained a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in theology from Ave Maria University and completed her doctorate at Regent University in Virginia. Her dissertation focused on the experience of loneliness in Christian sexual minorities navigating permanent singleness. Dr. Sadusky completed her pre-doctoral internship at Biola University Counseling Center in La Mirada, California, and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at a partial hospitalization unit for eating disorders here in Denver. She has co-authored 2 books with Dr. Mark Yarhouse, Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experiences of Today's Youth, and Gender Identity and Faith, Clinical Postures, Tools, and Case Studies for Client-Centered Care. Together, they contributed a chapter to the book titled Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 Views. Will you help me welcome Dr. Julia Sadusky?
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you all. It's nice to be living so close to this talk. Usually I travel quite a bit, and so snow didn't bother me this morning one bit. What a pleasure to get to share with you today. Really excited for this talk. When Jason and I were planning it, I told him so often I tend to get in a rhythm of saying the same thing over and over again. And today was really meaningful for me to be able to think a little bit more deeply about how do we comprehensively offer a compelling and credible Christian witness to people in our communities, specifically around sexuality and gender. So I'm excited to share that with you today, some of my thoughts, some of my writing in this area. One of the things that really strikes me as I sit with you and think about what it is to offer a compelling and credible witness is so much energy when we talk about mental health in the church, when we talk about mental health with young people today, is looking outside of our communities and kind of pointing the finger at something out there that is hurting our kids. Have you heard that framing? Like, it's those people out there, which, for what it's worth, is a defense mechanism, right? It's something we do to make sense of hard things, is we like to kind of point out there and say, yeah, that's the problem. Now, you may ask yourself, how effectively does that help us mobilize and move towards action that is constructive? So we want to start actually with the barriers in ourselves, yes, in our culture and in our communities, to being a compelling, credible witness, especially to youth today. The first thing that comes to mind for me is our own emotional reactivity. If you're a clinician in the room, or you're a pastor, or you're an educator, or you're a parent, you can relate to this, right? How many times when we're sitting across from somebody, whether it's our child, our friend, a peer, a student, do we have a ton of emotion that rushes in? And then we look back on that conversation and say, wow, I don't know what came over me, but I really lost it there. And young people, especially empathic teens, can tell. if we're experiencing a lot of reactivity. They can pick up on it. And even if our fear is really from a place of protectiveness, even if the anger that we show, the passion, is really from a place of love and care, what a teenager interprets that as is, you are too fragile to receive me here. And they would rather stay attached to you than to bring whatever they brought up again. Because they care more about being connected to you than getting their needs met. Now, they may act out, right? Or they may act in to manage that. But the emotional reactivity is a barrier to compelling and credible witness. Because we don't get the opportunity to actually walk with people long term if they can pick up on the reactivity. So our own emotional regulation is key. If you're in ministry, if you're a therapist, if you're a pastor, who are you talking to? When I tell people as a therapist, as a psychologist, that I have a therapist, many people will say, why do you need a therapist? And the first thing I say is, are you alive today? I mean, look. And the second thing I say is, do you know what I do for work? We all need people in our corners to help us manage our own emotions, to not be reactive. The next thing I want to talk about is the sociocultural shifts that we are part of and privy to today. There has been a real shift, probably over the course of the last 30, 40 years, in the philosophical frameworks that really embed within our culture. These frameworks are non-theistic. They're not founded in a belief of God, the divine, and they're inherently relativistic. And what I mean by that is there's a fundamental assumption that there is not one absolute truth. There are many lowercase t truths. And your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. And who am I to say anything about you? And who are you to say anything about me? What flows from this is a framing of sources of power and authority as sources of oppression, fundamentally and absolutely. Think about what that does in the context of Christian ministry. God is authority, and not just authority, but supreme authority, the one who we would come under the mission of as followers of Christ. That makes it incredibly difficult. That is a barrier for compelling and credible witness, because any one of us who are Christians, in any role that we play, are seen with suspicion in a way that I don't think we've been seen historically. I think that has something to do with the philosophical and sociocultural shifts. So you have stimulus value. And it's not good enough for us to just say, but I'm a loving Christian. We have to build trust. We don't have a right to be trusted by virtue of our role, and that's something that has shifted. We, in fact, are seen as a source of scrutiny way more often because of our role. So if you feel pressure from that, you're in good company. There's a lot of pressure within that for us. This next thing that I want to speak on is how often we confuse the political domain for the private and public domain of engagement. I write a lot about this in other things that I've written around gender and sexuality in particular. The number one mistake I see us making in families, in Christian church contexts, in schools, Christian education settings, is when a person shares with us about their questions around sexuality or gender, or they share about an identity label they're using, we assume that person is almost like the representative from the political domain that just got dropped in our community. And what is our response? Usually fear. Threat, you are threat. There are political activists. There are theorists out there that subscribe to things that are different from a Christian understanding of the person. And maybe for some of you, you're politicians, so that's your role, is to step into those spaces. For most of us, we are stepping into the public domain, meaning we go to the grocery store, we encounter people who have maybe they, them pronouns on their name tag at that, Safeway. And maybe you wear something that shows you're a Christian and people see that, and the way you look at them, the way you treat them is gonna have a profound impact on whether they have an experience of a Christian that is positive. Or the private domain, where a teen comes to you and says, I've never told anybody this in our church, but I need you to know that I feel like I don't know who I am. I wonder if I'm a boy or a girl or something else. The last thing I want to say about this is a story from yesterday. I was meeting with a client, and they came in and they identify as transgender, and they were raised in a Christian home, but have since stepped away from practicing their faith. And this client said to me, I've been going to a Bible study with one of my friends from senior in high school, from my high school, every week for the past 2 weeks, really enjoying it, kind of interesting. But last week when I was there, it got political really fast. Before I knew it, we were talking about, what people think about those crazy transgender people. And I tried to say something. I said, well, I think we have to be respectful of people. And 4 of the 5 kids in that Bible study rolled their eyes. And I don't know if I can go back, which is a real bummer because I really like learning about Jesus. I'm really interested in learning about what the Bible has to say. But I just don't want to get hurt. And don't hear me say that and think what I mean by that is the solution is to just set aside anything in Bible studies that will be upsetting or problematic to people or challenge them in their beliefs, okay? But think about that person's entry into that setting. And who in that group of 5 is being taught by their parents, by their youth ministers, that if that comes up and there's a new member and you have the sense that maybe they're not convinced by all this, who's going to step in as a Christian and say, hey guys, we don't talk about people that way. We don't call people those crazy people. I just can't imagine Jesus doing that. And this brings up the final piece. We lack compelling and credible role models, don't we? You can look on podcasts, you can go on all of your favorite news sites, and you can see lots of people talking about sexuality and gender today. There is no shortage of that. But who can we turn to as compelling and credible role models for us? And who can we point young people to within our communities to say, you belong here so much that there is a whole group of people, myself included, who are making it part of our job to learn how to effectively show up for you and with you, and to bring you more deeply into the body of Christ. So what are our models for ways to engage? I'm offering this suggestion that we lack credible and compelling role models. So what are the models that are given to us in culture, in social media, in news sources? Some of this comes from work I've done with Mark Yarhouse, and what we would offer is this, that there are culture warriors, there are cultural capitulators, and then there are cultural ambassadors. Spoiler alert, I'm suggesting the third. Okay? But let's talk about what we all get caught up in, okay? What I get caught up in, what you get caught up in individual moments, is we kind of ebb and flow between different roles. So the cultural warrior. When I'm in that cultural warrior place, I'm drawn to lecture and cognitive disputation. I've got my argument, I've got my points, I've got my philosophy, and I'm like, you're wrong about this, and that's illogical for these reasons, and boom, boom, boom. And it feels so good, doesn't it, to win an argument? The truth of it, though, is isn't that rooted in fear in a lot of ways? Fear of feeling threatened by another person. Fear of not saying the right thing, not being a good Christian who tells somebody the truth. An us versus them mentality, those people over there that we need to change. The outcome of this that I see as a clinician, I mentioned this about that person yesterday, but I see it time and time again, is alienation and youth rejection of the faith as hateful. And teens, if they're honest, they'll say to me, well, my mom made so many good points. She may even be right. But she was so mean about it. Or, but I wouldn't let her say any of that to 5 of my friends at school because her tone of voice was so condescending. So if the hope, and I believe it is a good hope, is to bring the truth of who God is and who we are to people, we don't bring it to people if there's nobody in the room. We can feel really good, but there's nobody really staying around to talk to, except for the people who already believe what you and I believe. And that's just not evangelization. Cultural capitulator. When I'm in this place, I sit in a place of silence, and I may convey to other people apathy. Like, oh, I don't know. Maybe not. Somebody asks, what does our church think about sexuality? Sometimes this is rooted in a fear due to lack of formation. Have you ever felt that way? Like, I don't know enough about this. That's what I hear a lot. People hear I'm a specialist in gender, and anytime they talk to me, they're like, well, who am I? I don't know. I'm like, well, you probably know something. You're okay. Talk to me. Right? Fear, because we don't feel well formed. Well, that's part of what we're doing here today, isn't it? And you guys have limited time and limited resources, so it's really nice to come to a place where you can get a crash course in a lot of things. You don't have time to read 10 books a week. So sometimes we're afraid and we stay silent because we don't feel like we have anything good to say. And in those moments, I just want to invite you to invite the Holy Spirit. He knows way more than anything I'm going to share or anybody else is going to share today. And he's not surprised or scandalized by any of where we are. He saw this coming. And sometimes that feels like a cop-out, but I think that is the most practical strategy on the face of the earth. In addition to educating yourself, if you're sitting with somebody and you don't know what to say, pray. And say to the person, you know what, I'm going to take a moment and I'm just going to pray for some wisdom here. Because to be honest with you, I don't know what to say. I feel really ineffective. And in ministry to youth, you know what they're going to hear? We're not so different after all. You have questions, you're in good company. Not what most teens assume, which is if I have questions, I don't have a place at the table. I've got to be perfectly convinced by all this stuff in order to step foot in here, or at least to stay. And we can model something different there by our humility. And what the outcome of, I think, this fear of speaking out about what we can know, what we do know, or at least speaking out about the things we don't know and are not sure about, is we lose a distinction between a Christian witness and a secular witness. To young people, they look around and they think, what's the difference between you and everybody else? You're not saying anything. So, cultural warrior, I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to win. Cultural capitulator, I want to be liked. I don't know what to say. I'll stay silent. What if we were cultural ambassadors, and not just cultural ambassadors for ourselves, but also raising kids and teens who are cultural ambassadors and who are not afraid? What's the strategy for this? It starts with forming ourselves. We want to talk about youth and their social media exposure, and I'm here for that. They are inundated, and I could tell you all the horror stories in the world of what they get exposed to. But I want to talk for a minute about what you're exposed to. The sources of media that you hear and receive and listen to, are they making you an effective and credible and compelling Christian witness? Or do they paralyze you? Because it starts with formation of ourselves. I think it was Mother Teresa who would spend an hour every day praying before she would go out into the streets, and a secular journalist said to her, think about all the people you could help if you would go out that extra hour. Why do you sit in the chapel and pray? And she smiled at him and she said, oh gosh, I can't do any of it if I don't spend that hour in prayer. And for Americans, we're like an hour. So it doesn't have to be an hour. But it can be. But how are you being formed in Christ's likeness? How are you being formed in virtue? And that takes honesty about the places we fall short. And if we can't be honest with people in our lives as adults, we're not going to help the next generation reduce their own shame. This approach, cultural ambassador, is rooted in courage. It's rooted in compassion, which literally means to suffer with. And it's rooted in conviction. So much of the cultural narrative of what it is to be loving and caring lacks conviction. And our faith is not fragile. So when I sit across from somebody who sees everything in the world, it seems, differently from me, I don't have to throw it in their face because it's not fragile. It's not less true because I didn't say it perfectly or didn't say it in every moment. It's the truth of my faith that is not fragile that gives me the confidence and the courage to lead into relationships with people. The outcome of being a cultural ambassador is that we can have clarity of our position, our theological principles, the things that root us and make us different from people who are not people of faith, and critically engage with culture in reflective and respectful ways. Because I don't know about you, but the people I respect most are people who are a little bit older and sit back in their chair as they hear me tell them something about whatever it is, and they think about it. And they might say, what I really like about that is this. A question that comes to mind, though, is this. And before I know it, I've learned a lot, but I didn't realize they were teaching me. Thought we were just having a conversation. That's what you and I can be. Oh, queer theory. I've heard about that, but tell me what you've heard about that. What have you read? What's your understanding of queer theory, 14-year-old youth? Well, it's this, and I've heard that, norms of sex and gender are outdated, and they're oppressive, and they're bad, and they need to be gotten rid of. Where did you learn about that? It sounds like you've done your research. Yeah, well, this, and I've read it, my friends told me, and I read this article by this person, and okay. Yeah, what I really appreciate about what you're bringing up as you talk about queer theory is that over the course of time and space, gender norms, specifically stereotypical ones, have been problematic for a lot of people. There have been times where I, and maybe you, have really been negatively impacted by some of those stereotypes. What are some of the things you would say about that? Here's what I would say. But what I have questions about, one question I guess that comes to mind is, I wouldn't probably go as far as to say it's only ever a source of oppression. I think about the way that sex and gender norms have been anchoring for most people in identity over time. So I wonder if there's a way to hold both of those things. I think that's critical engagement with culture. And if I'm 15 and I'm hearing you say that, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I've never heard anybody say that. What else do they have to say? And this is not about stroking your ego and making you feel like you said a nice thing to a teenager or something really compelling. It's about pointing them to Christ, right? Because it's not just, I want to hear what my youth minister or my therapist or my parent has to say. It's, I want to know about the person they follow. I want to know about the person they talk to in the morning and in the middle of the day and in the evening. That's evangelization. It's not because we have a good argument, and it's not because we stay silent. So the last few pieces I want to hit on are this. I want us to know a little bit more about the risk factors for youth who may or may not identify as LGBT, but certainly are asking questions around sexuality and gender. I want to talk about the things that make their life harder, that you and I can do something about. And I want to talk about the protective factors, the things we can do differently that can make our communities much more compelling and credible witnesses to them, and frankly, improve their mental health. So the Family Acceptance Project, Caitlin Ryan's institute, has done a ton of research on the impact of certain behaviors on LGBT identifying youth. She identifies a range of rejecting behaviors, things that if we do them, they cause harm in these kids, and they increase depression, anxiety, suicidality, okay? So if you've always wondered, what do I not do? Here's what you don't do. Probably with anybody, by the way, but it applies to LGBT youth. Causing physical harm to a child. Name calling, verbal aggression to a child. Isolating a child or teen from events because of their sexuality or gender. Blaming a child for bullying or harassment they encounter, saying something like, well, when you walk that way, you know, people are going to make those comments. Or you dyed your hair purple, what do you expect? And I wish these were not real examples, but they are. Pressuring a child to engage in gender-typical behaviors rooted in stereotypes. If all of your youth events that are split up by gender, or in your family, the activities split by gender are stereotyped, it doesn't compel your teen then when you say there's a lot of ways to be a girl and a boy. Because they picked up on the subtle message that no, there's really one way to be a Christian girl. And you're going to journal and make flower bouquets. And if you're a boy, you're going to hit trees down. So we're getting better at this, by the way. Thankfully, this doesn't happen quite as often. But I want you to just think, what are the messages we send about what it is to be a boy and a girl, a man and a woman? Because I can tell you the amount of times that parents say to me, I don't know where they got the idea that girls have to be sensitive and cry, and boys are like strong and carry things. And then that teen comes to me and it's like, gosh, growing up, anytime we were moving something, they would say, you can't help because you're a girl. And I'm not here to like say there are no differences between boys and girls and men and women. I'm just here to talk with you about not reinforcing harmful stereotypes that complicate identity development. We are in part responsible for that. That's not just a cultural problem. That's an us thing too. Highlighting God will punish a child because of their questioning. You will go to hell. Communicating you're ashamed of the child for their exploration and telling them not to tell anyone even if they want to. This is really important with youth. Well-meaning adults can feel grateful that you got confided in, and then not think to ask, who else knows? And if they don't know, how can I help bridge the gap? How can I help connect you to other trusted adults? Because that savior complex is tempting if you're a therapist or you're a teacher or you're the parent that everybody talks to. Teens need a lot of people in their corner. You are one of those people, and if you are the only one, take steps to make that different. Doesn't have to be tomorrow, and you don't have to disclose on somebody's behalf. This is not a safety issue, okay? And if there are safety issues that you know of with teens, in the context of them disclosing something to you, let's say a teen says, I'm same-sex attracted and I'm suicidal. You can tell their parent they're suicidal without telling their parent something they haven't shared yet, especially if you don't know the degree to which in that moment that parent's going to be able to receive both of those disclosures at the same time. Okay? What are the protective factors, the things that increase belonging, connectedness, understanding, and support? This may surprise you. The number one predictor of an LGBT-identified teen's well-being over time, the number one predictor of their well-being, is the quality of their relationship with their parents. And in the broader culture, there is a move away from parental involvement. So this is a distinctively Christian contribution to say, I want to help improve the quality of this relationship so I can validate and support a teen who's frustrated with their parents. I mean, gosh, what teen isn't, right? And I can also help problem solve to reduce conflict if I'm the therapist, if I'm the teacher, if I'm the parent that they talk to. Okay. What are we doing to help reduce conflict? This is a common thing that helps reduce the likelihood of mental health concerns. And identify common goals. What are the things that teens and their parents can agree on is a good thing to work towards, as the sexuality and gender stuff is a source of tension? Who are the non-parent adult relationships, providers, teachers, informal mentors, faith community, and cultural communities that these kids have access to? Maybe you're one of those people. Earlier it was mentioned the casserole situation, and I just can't say enough about how accurate that is. But if you heard in your small group that somebody had a young person come out to them in their family, and instead of saying, well, have you thought about maybe stopping working because maybe you're not spending quality time with them enough? And instead said, hey, what can I do to be an extra adult in your corner to walk with them? Can I get coffee with your teen? Just to be another adult to support. We need non-parent adult relationships for these kids and teens, and many of them will say to me, I can't go to youth group because I don't know how the friends in youth group will respond if I be honest about what I'm wrestling with here. So what are the other access points to their faith community? And then supportive peer relationships. Are you aware of and involved with teen friendships? Do you know who they're talking to? Some parents will say to me, some therapists will say to me, I don't want to know who their friends are. Because it's a bit overwhelming once you start to find out who they're talking to online and what they're talking about. It can be a lot. So how aware are we and involved in the friendships of these teens? Because what they tell you about their friendship and what's going on in their friendship are two different things, I can promise you that. It goes back to the reactivity. They worry about how you'll respond. Who's monitoring technology and social media? Who's helping our teens critically engage? Pay attention to how they feel when they watch certain things. And who can they go to if they saw something on there they didn't want to see? Can you give examples to teens about, yeah, sometimes when we're online, we see pictures and videos that really upset us. There's a lot out there. When that happens, there's nowhere else I'd rather you go than to come to me, to share that with me. And if you come and you share that with me, you're not going to get in trouble. I'm going to help you figure out what to do with that. If you're familiar with EMDR, it's a processing therapy. The amount of times that people get referred to EMDR because they saw something terrible in a video online, it's hard to fully appreciate how traumatizing those moments can be for teens. And then the other point here is, how do we help teens contribute to their community? Helping them see themselves not just as recipients of our care, but actual contributing members, developing members of society. Talk about belonging, connectedness, meaning, and purpose. I can tell you that's what these teens need more than anything. A place to channel all that passion into something constructive where they feel like they belong. And here are the accepting behaviors. So I want to be clear. Remember I mentioned rejecting behaviors. Now I'm going to mention accepting behaviors. Caitlin Ryan is clear. You do not have to do all the accepting behaviors to protect the harm against this population. You just have to stop doing the rejecting ones. But maybe there are some accepting behaviors that you can take note of here and think, oh, I could do that. Things like talking with the youth about their sexuality and gender questions. Hey, how's that going for you? I know you shared that with me. I wanted to circle back. Is that something you want to talk about more? Express affection when they tell you or when you learn they're exploring these things. Maybe you give them a hug. Maybe you tell them you're proud of them. God's proud of them for sharing about this experience. Advocate for them when they're mistreated. Require that others respect these youth. The number one thing that happens in Christian institutions is not that teachers talk negatively about LGBT people, it's that students do and teachers don't speak up. How do we speak up in a way that doesn't lose the kid who made the comment? That doesn't humiliate them, but also teaches them how to be a credible witness. Talk with clergy and help your faith community offer compassionate care. Connect your child with an adult role model. Welcome youth's friends, get to know them, help them navigate those relationships and identify harmful behaviors, and believe the teen can have a happy future as an adult. That's harder than you think. Do I believe they can have a happy and healthy adult life? A life in Christ. Okay, I want to end here. One of the things that I think a lot about in talking with youth about sexuality is sexual stewardship. There's a fundamental biblical principle of stewardship that applies to a lot of things. It applies to our finances, right? It applies to our property. It also applies to our body and our sexuality. And if we could talk about things like chastity as stewardship of our bodies, and stewardship, we are our brother's keeper, and we belong to each other, and we impact each other. I mean, that stat you shared about suicidality and sexual behavior, that blew my mind, and I do this work. Do teens know that? Do they know that most teens aren't sexually active, actually, and that number keeps going down? Because the more they think it's happening, the more they'll do it. So do we have a developmental approach to sexual conversations where we're talking about sexuality in ongoing ways? So the first time you're not talking about this is when they're 10 or 11 or 12. I've written 2 books recently on this point because I'm aware that we are catching up with culture, and culture is inundating young people with conversations about sexuality so young. By the time they're 13 and you want to talk with them about sexual intercourse, they're looking at you like you don't know what you're talking about because you don't know the 10 things I've learned already, right? So developmental conversations. Presenting a positive vision of sexual ethics. I put some resources on this slide that I think do a really good job of that. Anticipating challenges and detours all along the way. Let's not be scandalized when our teens are not compelled by this right away. So don't leave this presentation and think, I'm going to be so compelling, and then you go back to your setting and then they're not compelled by it. Well, they're a teenager. Were you compelled by everything people told you that was true when you were 13? No, okay? Anticipating challenges and detours. Helping them know there's a place for them if they're not convinced. Reducing shame. Yeah, that's a really human challenge. Gosh, I can relate to what you're saying, and so many people can. You're not alone in that. and pointing to concrete resources for youth and their families. Usually we jump to that last one. That's why I put it last. People are like, oh, I have a book for you. Okay, that's great. Books are great. People don't have time to read, though. Trust me, I know, I write books. Okay. So on this last slide, I just give you my contact information, some of the resources I've contributed to. I'm so grateful for this time today. I hope the Q&As can be helpful to dig in a little bit more to the practicals in your settings, and God bless you in your ministry.